Okay, we're going to start by, in our little atheist book, we're going to talk about questions 7 through 11. So we are on page 20, 26. We'll talk about that. We'll read a little bit. And we might get to question 12. That's the plan, but best laid plans and all that. What were some of the fascinating claims that came from the legendary astronomer and agnostic Robert Jastrow? So what was claim number 1 on page 77? Go ahead.
He likens the world to
Right. So he compares the universe to a wound up clock, and if you're going to wind up a clock, now I know that you don't use that anymore, but back in the day, right? My husband had like really high technology, like as he moved, as his arm moved, it wound the clock. That was like, woo, that was big time technology when he was in high school. So yeah, the universe is like a wound up clock. Someone had to wind it up. This is an agnostic, right? He's admitting that there's something beyond the universe that created the universe. What was claim number 2 on page 82?
You made explanation about fireball radiation.
Right. So the radiation that was found by Penzias and Wilson that was so precise, it supports a Big Bang. And he said it ends any claim to it, or steady state. It ends any possibility of an eternal universe. So, and it supports the Big Bang. It looks like the cause was the Big Bang. What was claim number 3 on page 84? Yes.
They knew eventually. Suddenly and sharply and indefinitely.
Say that again, Paul.
The chain of events leading to man, and suddenly and sharply.
Okay, and what does he say that supports? Yeah.
The central evidence in Big Bang and Genesis.
Yeah. So he's saying, when he's saying that the astronomical evidence leads to a biblical origin. It reads like Genesis. The science reads like Genesis, in other words. A biblical view of origin. He's agnostic. And yet he's saying that. And then what was claim number 4 on pages 84 and 85? It's basically the same thing. 84, I might have misread these. The astronomical evidence leads to a biblical view of origin. The science leads to a biblical view of origin. Yeah. 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 So here's this agnostic saying there's got to be something supernatural involved. Here's what he says. He says atheistic astronomers have, quote, painted themselves into a corner. That's also a kind of a colloquialism. If you paint yourself into a corner, like you're painting something on the ground, and you paint yourself into a corner, you can't get out, right? You're going to have to walk over what you just painted. So you want to make sure you have an escape. So they painted themselves into a corner because their own methods have proved a very sudden beginning. And so the existence of the supernatural, as you said, is a proven fact in his mind, scientifically proven. What was the claim number 5 on page 88? It's not a scientific. Yeah.
The universe had a beginning, so it had a cause.
Okay, the universe had a beginning, so it had a cause. But this one is more about scientists themselves. Go ahead, Autumn.
Scientists will always be upset if there is no
Yeah, scientists act much like anyone else when their evidence doesn't support what they believe. They get irritated. They can get salty. That's probably the way you guys would put it these days, right? And that's interesting. So number 8, summarize the definition offered by Arthur Eddington of the second law of thermodynamics. What did he say? The second law. Yes.
there is no acceptance to it appears.
Right, exactly. So the second law of thermodynamics is that entropy increases, that over time things degrade, right? They come to an end. We were driving, Josh was, I don't know, 6, 7 years old, and we had this old beat up van at that time. And we passed a car literally right outside here on Fort Crook Road. And it was a Cadillac from yesteryear back then. Like it was probably 20 years old then. And it was rusted out and it was several different colors and the top vinyl T-top was flapping in the wind. I mean, it was just a nasty car. And I turned to Josh and I said, when that thing was new, it was one of the nicest cars on the road. And he laughed at me. He's like, no, Mom, that was never a nice car. That's an example of entropy, right? Everything degrades. And so he says that it is the highest law of nature. And if any theory contradicts it, the theory's doomed. You can't contradict it. And that points right back to a beginner of the universe. Something had to wind up that clock. Number 9, how does the expanding universe prove a beginning? Yeah.
If everything's expanding, like rewind.
Yeah, it assumes a beginning, right? Much like an explosion somewhere, you would assume that explosion started somewhere. It didn't just show up like that. Somebody lit the fuse and it exploded. So it assumes a beginning, and he likened it to like watching a movie backwards. Have you ever done that? Can't do it. So this is easy, I don't think. But yeah, and it goes back to nothing. Number 10, what are some views espoused by atheists that offer explanations of the existence of the universe? So what are some alternate theories that don't require a God, don't require somebody creating the universe? No, the Big Bang Theory does. The Big Bang Theory it shows that there is a God. Whether scientists believe that, that's exactly what we're talking about. These are alternate to the cosmic rebound theory. Ben, what does that say? Yeah, it's kind of this, right? We're just in an expanding phase right now, and then it'll start to shrink again. And so, if you would please turn to page 88. 86. So we just said what it is. So first and most obviously, there's no evidence for an infinite number of bangs. So these explosions that expand and then it kind of contracts forever. And then secondly, there's not enough matter in the universe to pull everything back together. The universe doesn't have the ability to. It doesn't have what it needs to retract. And then third, even if there were enough matter to cause the universe to contract and bang again, the cosmic rebound theory contradicts the second law of thermodynamics, that everything tends to, and we've already heard from atheistic scientists that you can't contradict them. It is an unassailable law. It is a law without exception. So that's the cosmic rebound theory. What was another one?
The imaginary time theory.
Imaginary time. That alone just makes my brain hurt. You know, and Stephen Hawking was one of the most brilliant human beings ever. He gave this up at some point. We read about that, right? Why God did not create the earth. He ended up before his death believing that there were multiple universes, one of which spun off our universe. So even he was like, yeah, that's an imaginary theory. And so this idea that time isn't a real thing, it's an imaginary thing. What's another one? Yes, and what does that say?
Evidence for the beginning of the universe so strong, some atheists question the first premise of the cosmological argument.
Right. So it says that, well, you know, every rule has an exception. And so then this is the exception to the law of causality. But that's self-defeating, right? That's what the book said. Okay, well, what's the exception to that exception? So, yeah, the law, because it's the exception to the law of causality, but then they have to say, but we have no idea how it got here. We have no idea how the universe got here after millennia of studying it. And then the last one we already mentioned is multiple universe theory, multiverse. I don't know if they mentioned that or not. They did that. I mentioned that. But there's absolutely no observable proof of other universes that could have spun our universe. So in the end, why don't these atheistic theories adequately explain the existence of the universe? Yes.
Does the universe have a beginning?
It's that simple. The universe had a beginning, and therefore it needs a cause. Look, the truth cannot be found if you take some options off the table. If you don't leave all options on the table, it's the same thing when you're taking the ACT, Logan. If you don't leave all options in, right, you can slash some of them as you see they're wrong, right? But you don't just say, well, we can't, without figuring that out. And that's what they do. They say, well, the answer can't be God. And so they remove one of the possible answers, and the answer cannot be found if you assume that there is no God. You're going to say something? Okay, that's good. Turn, please, to page 89. And follow along with me. What if the Big Bang Theory is wrong? So far, we've given solid scientific evidence. I want to say, because David said something about the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory is not the issue. I know a lot of Christians say that the Big Bang never happened, that God created the universe. The science says that the Big Bang happened. The question that we're dealing with is what began? What or who began? That's the question we're talking about. Not, is the Big Bang proved? It is. And it reads like Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's nothing that says it couldn't have been a Big Bang. So that's what if the Big Bang Theory is wrong? So far, we've given solid scientific evidence, surge, for the fact that the universe had a beginning. But suppose scientists wake up one day and find out that all of their calculations have been wrong. It was no Big Bang. Given the wide scope of the evidence and the ability of the theory to correctly predict so much observable phenomena, a total abandonment of the Big Bang would be extremely unlikely. This is admitted even by atheists. Victor Stenger, a physicist who taught at the University of Hawaii, once wrote that the universe exploded out of nothingness. Stenger recently acknowledged that the Big Bang is looking more probable all the time. We have to leave open the possibility that the Big Bang could be wrong, but every year that goes by and more astronomical data comes in, it's more and more consistent with at least the general Big Bang picture. Indeed, in 2003, more evidence came forth that the Big Bang is correct. NASA's WMAP satellite, Wilkinson Microwave Anisotropy probe, confirmed the findings of its predecessor, COBE, and returned pictures 35 times sharper than COBE's of the background radiation ripples. In fact, space observations are becoming so supportive of the theistic worldview that George Will uses, George Will was not a scientist. He was a, he was a writer. He was a writer, often about politics, but just about a kind of an editorialist on a lot of different topics, and a very brilliant guy. So he said this. Soon, the American Civil Liberties Union, or People for the American Way, or some similar faction of litigious secularism, so they bring a lot of lawsuits, will file suit against NASA, charging that the Hubble Space Telescope unconstitutionally gives comfort to the religiously inclined. Nevertheless, let's play skeptic's advocate for a second. Let's suppose that at some point in the future, the Big Bang Theory is deemed wrong. Would that mean that the universe is eternal? No, for a number of reasons. First, the second law of thermodynamics, the S in surge, supports the Big Bang but is not dependent on it. The fact that the universe is running out of usable energy and heading toward disorder is not even up for debate. In Eddington's work, the second law holds the supreme position in the laws of nature. It is true even if the Big Bang is not. Second, the same can be said for Einstein's theory of general relativity, the Eons. This theory, well verified by observation, requires the beginning to space, matter, and time, whether or not it all began with a bang. Third, there's also scientific evidence from geology that the universe had a beginning. As many of us learned in high school chemistry, radioactive elements decay over time into other elements. For example, radioactive uranium eventually turns into lead. This means that if all the radioactive uranium this means that all uranium atoms were infinitely old. They would, they would all be lead by now, but they're not. So the Earth cannot be infinitely old. Finally, there's a philosophical line of evidence for the beginning of the universe. Okay, this is deep stuff. So hang with me. It's one of the reasons why I'm reading this portion. It's a philosophical argument, cosmological argument. So the philosophical argument for the beginning of the universe. There's a philosophical line of evidence for the beginning of the universe. This line of evidence is so rationally inescapable that some consider it the strongest argument of all. It's called the kalam, from the Arabic word for eternal, cosmological argument. So this is, when I ask you, because some people get this wrong every time. When I ask you about the cosmological argument, I'm asking you that everything that had a beginning had a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. That's the cosmological argument. This is the philosophical cosmological argument. Does that make sense? It's also a logical argument, but it's from philosophy. That's why it's called the Kalam cosmological argument. So when I ask for the Kalam cosmological argument, I'm asking for this. When I ask for the cosmological argument, I'm asking for everything that had a beginning and a cause. Does that make sense? Okay, hopefully that's helpful to you in the very near future. And it goes like this. An infinite number of days has no end. But today is the end day of history, history being a collection of all days. Therefore, there were not an infinite number of days before today. In other words, time had a beginning. I'm going to read about this a little bit. I'm going to try and do my best to explain this to you because it is deep stuff. To grasp this argument, see the timeline below, marked in segments of days. The further left you go, the further back in history you go. Now assume for a moment that this line extends to the left indefinitely, so that you can't see if or where it begins. But as you look to the right, you can see the end of the line, because the last segment of the line represents today. Tomorrow isn't here yet. But when it gets here, we'll add one more segment a day to the right end of the line. Now, here's how this proves that time had a beginning. Since the line certainly ends on the right, the timeline cannot be infinite because something that is infinite has no end. Moreover, you can't add anything to something that is infinite. But tomorrow we will add another day to our timeline, supposedly. So our timeline is undeniably finite. Let's consider this argument from a different angle. If there were an infinite number of days before today, then today would never have arrived. But here we are. So there must have been only a finite number of days before today. In other words, even though we may not be able to see as we look to the left where the line begins, we know it had to begin at some point because only a finite amount of time could have passed for today to have arrived. You can't traverse an infinite number of days. Thus, time must have had a beginning. Some may say that infinite numbers can exist, so why can't infinite days? Because there's a difference between an abstract infinite series and a concrete one. The one is purely theoretical, the other is actual. Mathematically, we can conceive of an infinite number of days, but actually we could never count or live an infinite number of days. You can conceive of an infinite number of mathematical points between two bookends on a shelf, but you could not fit an infinite number of books between them. That's the difference between an abstract and a concrete. Numbers are abstract, days are concrete. By the way, this amplifies our answers above as to what there could not have been, why there could not have been an infinite number of bangs in the cosmological history of the universe. An infinite number of actual events is impossible. What we are saying here is that the universe, the Big Bang or not, had a beginning. That is, the cosmological argument is true, both premises, the cosmological argument is true because both premises of the argument are true. Everything that comes to be has a cause, and the universe came to be. Since the universe had a beginning, it must have had a beginner. Now, here's the thing, and this is the way I explain it, and maybe one of these explanations makes more sense to you, so if it does, go with it, right? Infinity has to go both directions. And for something to be infinite, for time to be infinite, it has to be infinite in both directions. You remember, those of you who were with us last year, we talked about the pre-existence of Christ, that Christ has always been. Infinity has to go to the left in their case, into the past infinitely. But that's not infinite. If it stops, it's no longer infinite. Infinite is forever, right? We are finite beings. We had a beginning and we'll have an end. If we know Jesus, will we live forever? Yes. In this direction. But that doesn't make us infinite. We're not infinite, we're finite, because we haven't always been. So the only things that are infinite are those things that have always been and will always be. And you can't count days that haven't come yet. There's no way of doing it. Will the universe have an end? And the science says that, but the Bible says that as well in Revelation, right? And then there's a new heaven. So there can't be an infinite number of days in the past. Therefore, the universe has a beginning. Philosophically. Yeah.
So, like, for that argument, like, if we're picturing a number line, which is what my brain goes to, couldn't we just be like a number line can be infinite, it can go in both directions. Couldn't we just be like 0.0 on it, everything, like, if all of history is negative, and then all of these come to positive, but there's still, like, there's, yeah,
But they're
like,
theoretical days. They're theoretical. See, what you're talking about is something theoretical. A number line is theoretical. It's not actual. But the future days are that you can't have a theoretical infinity in practice. This is how it says here. So yeah, it says it talks about the exact same thing you just talked about, that number line. It says some may say that infinite numbers can exist. So why can't infinite days? Because there's a difference between an abstract infinite series, which is a number line, and a concrete one. One is purely theoretical, the other is actual. Mathematically, we can conceive of an infinite number of days, but actually, we could never count or live an infinite number of days. You can conceive of an infinite number of mathematical points between two bookends on a shelf, but you cannot fit an infinite number of books. So that's the difference between an abstract and a concrete. Yes. Right. Right. So he is actually infinite, has always been, and he always will be. But I'm going to kind of beg off for now because that's where we're headed this whole semester. So the evidence for God will be laid out. We're just like right at the beginning of this 7 chapters of showing that God exists. But nobody is forced to believe that, right? And most people make a decision on whether there's a God or not, just based on their own thoughts, and their own theories, and their own desires. What we're going to do is look at evidence. And we have to begin with, was there a beginning? And if there was a beginning, somebody began it. And who is that somebody? We haven't gotten to the who is that somebody. Yes?
so if you're saying that the infinite, like, number of days is just, like, a theory, right? Could we also turn that around and say that finite number of days is also just theoretical? I just don't get how it goes.
No, a finite number of days can be known to a certain degree.
How?
Well, if you know, you can go back in history.
Yeah,
So,
backwards, but how can we know?
oh, yeah, we can't, and that's the point. We can't know. We can't know, and the science says the universe had a beginning. It also says the universe will have an end. And so then it's this argument is just trying to get to the point that the universe isn't eternal. And it's philosophically saying the same thing that the science says. But yeah, the universe is not eternal, despite the fact that we don't know how many days are. Because in order to be eternal, remember, it has to be eternal in both directions. And do we know tomorrow's coming?
Like find out like based on like past dues and or like
The cop-out answer is that it'll end when God says so. But the science says it's like millions, billions of years. I think it's, God says so. I shall be rolled up as a scroll. No, if you have a beginning and no end, you're not infinite.
Exactly.
It could, but that's not what the science says, and it's not what the Bible says. But I mean, it could. But the point is, it's not infinite. In that case, it's okay. Let's look at question 12 and see if we can answer this. We'll get to it tomorrow. You know what? We've used our brains enough for one Bible period. We're not expecting to use it. So we'll do that tomorrow, and then we'll do the engage together tomorrow as well.